Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our final workshop in our series, Calling in Educational Psychology Researchers. I am Temitope Adelie, but I go by Temi or Dr. T, as students call me. I'm clinical assistant faculty at Purdue University and the assistant director of the Blue Sky Teaching and Learning Lab in the John Martinson Honors College at Purdue. Allison, how about you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Zengalowski, and I am currently a postdoc at the University of California, Davis.
Great, thanks, Allison. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can walk together through our slides for the day. Okay, today, as I mentioned, we'll be getting into a session talking about disseminating and reimagining how we disseminate critical and multicultural research. So soon we'll be hearing from our three stellar panelists, but first I'm going to encourage you to prepare for the work that we'll be engaging in today by thinking about where you or your colleagues go to learn about and stay up to date on innovative research in EdPsych. Also think about if, and if so, where you see critical and multicultural research in educational psychology. And then throughout our session, hopefully that QR code is showing, but we'll also drop it in the chat. You can add to our Jamboard for this session, and we'll in that session document, go to session 4. There's a link that we'll be dropping in the chat for you to respond to some questions as we're listening to our panelists and engaging in discussion later. So as I mentioned, I'll go through this briefly. We're going to be talking about where to find and publish critical and multicultural research. We'll hear from our panelists and interrogate the systemic challenges that exist to publishing critical and multicultural research. We'll have a Q&A session as a full group with our panelists, and then we'll hear about the culmination of our series at AERA for those of you who are planning to attend in person next month. And so again, all of our files can be found in our Google folder. We are in the folder for session 4 today. So before I jump in, and again, you can be adding to that Jamboard, the link was dropped into the chat. But before we start, I thought it'd be important for us to define some of our terms. So specifically, whenever we talk about multiculturalism, we define that as an aim to elevate perspectives that have been silenced in traditional scholastic narratives. Specifically, multiculturalism aims to invite in the histories and experiences of people from cultures who have been left out in the curriculum. And so Marvin Lin sees critical research as rooted in critical race theory, which began in law, but so we're using their definition of rooting in critical scholarship as a critique of race and racism in the law and the broader society. But when we define that closer into educational psychology, the working definition Allison and I have been using is that critical educational psychology research is a critique of race and racism in learning environments. And so an important addition to that is that we should move beyond wanting to just pose problems to race, racism, and the structural and systemic challenges, but to start solving those problems, which is what we're calling EdPsych researchers in to do, is to be dissatisfied with offering critique just for the sake of offering critique. And so what we are hoping that through this series, you've gained some skills on how to start solving and addressing the systemic challenges of racism and all the other isms that keep us ostracized in our work. Oh, wrong way. Okay, so I'll stop sharing my screen so that we can get into our panel discussion. So now that we have some shared understandings of our definitions, I'm going to pass it on back to Allison so we can introduce our speakers and start our panel.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So joining us today, we have Dr. Christy Bird, who is an associate professor in the Department of Teacher Education and Learning Sciences at North Carolina State University. And we have Dr. Lisa Linenbrink Garcia, who is a professor in the Department of Counseling, Educational Psychology, and Special Education at Michigan State University. So let us start off the panel by first asking each of you in about a sentence to tell us a summary of your research interests and the voices you center. So let's start with Dr. Bird.
Well, hello, everyone. So my research in a nutshell is about how adolescents and young adults experience race and culture in their school environments. So I'm really interested in what they perceive about that, how it relates to their sense of self, their identities, and to their motivation for school.
I'm Lisa Lindenbrink Garcia. I'm a professor at Michigan State, and I study students' motivation, engagement, and persistence in STEM fields. And my more recent work is really focused on trying to support persistence of students from historically underrepresented groups through trying to understand mechanisms that might, psychological mechanisms that might inform our understanding of those different patterns of persistence, and also thinking about interventions to counter the factors that contribute to different patterns of persistence among students from underrepresented groups. And I would say that I'm definitely more of a novice to this field. There are many people on this call that have been doing this work much longer than I have. And so I think I was primarily also invited in my role as editor of Educational Psychologist. So within that work, Jeff Green, who's also on the call I see here, and I are both really committed to supporting research related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, to mentoring authors from diverse groups, and to elevating different voices than we might traditionally see within the field of educational psychology.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And so I'm curious from each of you about how you balance sharing research in prominent journals that may not always publish multicultural or critical research versus sharing research in spaces where you may know will value that. And so let's start with Dr. Bird again.
Yeah, so it's definitely something I think about. So I have a big gripe with educational psychology journals. And if you've known me long enough, you've heard this story where, years ago, I was a new assistant professor trying to publish my dissertation work on school racial climate. And I sent it to a prominent educational psychology journal, and it was rejected with what they told me was that you should send this to a social psychology journal. And I found that very hurtful. And I was just, it was one of those moments of like, wait a second, I graduated from an educational psychology journal. I went to the University of Michigan, for God's sake. I consider myself an educational psychologist. The work was citing lots of school climate people, Ryan in DC. And to be rejected like that felt very, was really one of those moments in my career where I wondered, like, okay, is this field actually for people like me? The good news of that story is that that paper was eventually accepted into an educational psychology journal. It was published in the British Journal of Educational Psychology. But I remember that, and I keep that in mind when I look for where to publish and when I talk to my students about where to publish. The journal that really has supported me throughout my career, that has offered me mentorship, has been Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology, which is the journal for APA Division 45. And those are the people basically that if I want serious feedback on my work, I'm going to turn to them before I turn to Psych people, because that's where I've consistently gotten good feedback. And that is something that I struggle with because, identifying as an educational psychologist, I want this field to be the place where my students would naturally turn to. But just sort of that sense of like, I've been rejected before, there's still inroads to be made within this field. It makes me think, right? So I have to balance that idea of where is my work going to get, recognized by these prominent people or the people who I want to read it, the people that I want to connect to in terms of the educational psychology theories that I'm using, compared to who's actually going to be able to read it and say, oh yeah, I understand what theories you're using, or not make assumptions, excuse me, I'm getting over something, not make assumptions that just because my work is about race, that it's not, it doesn't fit within, the idea of school climate or within educational psychology. So those are definitely things I think about a lot.
So again, as I said, I'm newer to the field, so my experiences have probably been a bit different in that there's been a shift in the way that the field has been thinking about this work. And so I would say that I've been fortunate to be working with really great students who have had success publishing this type of work in journals like Contemporary Educational Psychology, probably more so than Journal of Ed Psych, I would say. But I feel like to the degree that you can think about leveraging particular research designs that are maybe more appealing to educational psychology, that helps a bit. But I think that's unfortunate because that's not the only way to be doing this work. But I do think that makes it a little bit easier to get into some of those journals. And so in the work that I've been doing, we have really big longitudinal data sets. And so we get over the hump on some of the skepticism just based on our research design. And our group has been trying to leverage that in a way to bring light to that this work really does have a home in ed psych journals, but I feel like I'm kind of going in the more traditional way and not really pushing the boundaries very much in that work.
All right, well, thank you. And for building on some of those ideas, especially looking into the other aspects of the publishing and dissemination process, I'm curious about each of your perspectives on when you've reviewed works, what were things you wish or look to be included that show people are being really intentional about how they design and conduct multicultural and critical research. So let's start with you, Dr. Lindenbrink Garcia.
Sure. I mean, my thinking on this is not my own ideas, but kind of borrowing from the broader field, I would say that really thinking about how and why people are asking questions based on race and ethnicity or other demographic type variables. Are you asking a useful question that involves race or ethnicity, or are you simply including that variable in as a predictor because it's the thing to do, right? And to me, I think that that's where we really need to be pushing back as a field of making sure that when we ask these questions and we're comparing groups or only doing analyses within a particular group, that it's in a mindful way, rather than kind of what's historically been done within educational psychology, which results in a very deficit view of let's compare, white students to Black students and, use a deficit lens to frame whatever we find. And so I think as I'm, dipping my toe into this work, that's something that I really try to think about is how are people being thoughtful about the types of analyses they're running, how they're doing those analyses and what they're claiming based on those analyses.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think it's, you also have to realize that, especially when you're doing quantitative work, the research question may not necessarily be that complex, right? You might just be comparing two groups to each other. But you also have to think about what's the rationale for comparing those groups and kind of what's the theory that's going into that comparison and what are you trying to explain by doing that comparison. Sometimes if you have a certain data set, then those top level variables, just what racial ethnic group they belong to is the best that you have. But what you're actually talking about is maybe a cultural process or an identity process. And if you can put that into the literature review, if you can be citing the people who are thinking in complex ways about that, then for me as a reviewer, that gives me a much better sense that, okay, you're not just, you're not using those deficit perspectives. You're not just comparing these groups to kind of see what happens, right? You have some actual ideas about what's going on for real people and how they are individuals within these groups. And I think particularly when people are talking about, when studying effects of racism or talking about racism, I look for people to talk about it at a very structural level and not just think of it as some poor thing, something that's happening to some poor individual, right? That is part of a system, and that there are ways that society and schools and neighborhoods feed into those systems, and that people are responding as part of the system. So those are the things that I look for that, again, may not be in the analysis, but they'll be within the discussion section and the introduction and the interpretation of the findings and explaining why you're interested in those questions. And then again, the last thing I look for is who you're citing, right? Are you citing Frere? Are you citing Patricia Hill Collins? Even if they're not educational psychologists, even if they're not necessarily directly tied to your work, just knowing that that goes into your thinking gives me an understanding of what your lens is when you're doing the work.
So appreciate those thoughts. And going much more big picture, what are some of the systemic changes you either are implementing or feel need to be implemented to make journals themselves more actively inclusive and supportive of multicultural and critical research? And let's start with Dr. Lindenbrink-Garcia again.
Sure. So I think I'll answer this as editor. So within our Journal of Educational Psychology, we're really trying to think about who's on our editorial board, like who are we asking to do the reviews, and trying to have a broader perspective of who gets invited to the editorial board, who gets invited to do ad hoc reviews. As we're reviewing each work, really carefully considering that work for what it is, rather than trying to pigeonhole it into an existing tradition. And in doing so, being mindful about being open to other perspectives that might not have traditionally been published within the journal, but really could have a place within the field of educational psychology. I feel like we're a field that is steeped in tradition, and that it's a great opportunity as an editor to try to push back against that a little bit. And so to me, that's where a big difference can happen, is at the level of the editors and how they're thinking about the manuscripts that come into their journal.
Yeah, I would say as a reviewer, then I feel like my responsibility is to call out the really great things about this work when I do see it. Even when I'm critical about some points, it's like, okay, well, it's awesome that you're doing this, and I really respect that you use this framework and that framework. Sometimes I feel like I need to protect authors from other reviewers, right? So you'll get the reviews back. When you get the reviews back as a revision, you'll see how other reviewers have addressed things. So sometimes I'll make sure in my response to the second revision to say like, okay, well, I disagreed with reviewer one on this point and that sort of thing. So I see that as a way of having that conversation in the field to make sure that, these are other people who I have to make sure like, no, I'm knowledgeable about this area, and the way that they're doing it is consistent with how I, see this part. They're not just coming up with it on their own, because sometimes as a junior scholar, especially, there is that vulnerability that you have, right? Where it's like, well, I'm trying to present my viewpoint on this, but no one's backing me up, right? So as a reviewer, I can do that. And so I do think that, editors and other reviewers have that responsibility. I will put in a small plug for another committee that I'm on, the APA Division 15 Race and Diversity Committee. Last summer at APA, we did a session where we came up with some talking points for what are some things that should happen within the reviewing process. So I will put that in the chat. Some of the things that came out of those discussions specifically related to publishing, because I think that there were a lot of good ideas that came out of there.
So appreciate you thinking through those ideas. And yes, absolutely. We're so, the APA Division 15 Race and Diversity Committee has been a co-sponsor of this series, so we're very much appreciative of their ideas and support. I also want to tag in, we have Dr. Jamal Matthews, who is here, who is an associate professor in educational studies and the combined program in education and psychology at the University of Michigan. And so I'm hoping, Dr. Matthews, that you might be able to tag in on our last question here of thinking through some of the systemic changes either you are implementing or that need to be implemented to make journals more actively inclusive and supportive of multicultural and critical research.
Yeah, thank you. And I apologize for the lateness. There's all types of crazy going on in my house right now, but nevertheless, yeah, so, I've been associate editing at JP for the last couple of years or so. And, we've been trying to really think about these issues a lot. And I want to be just a little careful here not to share too much information from private conversations that, hasn't been announced publicly yet. But, I think one thing that, we're all sort of coming to the realization of, and the editor at JP is, coming to notice that just having culturally competent reviewers of color is a step in the right direction, but it's not enough. And there's a real need, I don't know if this came up already, but there's a real need to be much more intentional about developmental reviews, which I think, EP or educational psychologist is, I think getting pretty good at, and maybe Lisa talked about this already, but yeah, just the importance of developmental reviews, nurturing younger and more critically oriented scholars, in their ideas. And, this is just like a greater level of intentionality around making space for inclusiveness for these types of ideas and ideologies within more traditional or quote unquote prominent ed psych venues. But there's also a little bit of a systemic issue there, being in that, there's really not a large critical mass of middle level and senior level scholars of color in a lot of these, editorial or even reviewer positions. So it becomes quite a load for the scholars of color who do exist, in having to do these developmental type of reviews, which typically take, a lot longer than just your regular type of review. So while I do believe we need to go in this direction, it's hard, sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place, given the amount of work that this is going to, create for those scholars, and just trying to figure out how we manage that. I don't have, quite have all the answers there, but yeah, I think it's an issue that we need to figure out how to address.
So appreciate those thoughts and your responses and laying the foundation for us as a field, hopefully moving forward. So I will pass things along to Temi to facilitate a little bit of a broader discussion. Yeah, take it away, Temi.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. So feel free to unmute yourself. Well, raise your hand, I guess, so it doesn't get a little too rowdy in here. But raise your hand if you have a question, or you can drop your questions in the chat. I'm also going to hop into the Jamboard real quick just to see if there are any questions. So give me one moment to do that while you all take some time to type out any questions you have for our panelists. And by the way, on the Jamboard, that's slide 3. Okay, so then as we wait for questions to come in, I guess I'd pose to anyone in here. I just want to get a feel. So if you're typing a question, please don't stop typing your question. You can respond to the question I'm going to ask in the chat, but after you're done typing your question. But I'm curious to get a feel of where everyone's at. So if you are in a space where you are currently engaged in critical and multicultural research and ed psych and you're publishing, drop yes in the chat. If you're in a place where you're preparing something and so you're here to learn about where should you be publishing or other things about like getting started with this work, drop soon in the chat. And then if you're just here to learn about the current challenges and opportunities in publishing critical and multicultural research, drop hey in the chat. So again, yes, if you're doing it, soon if you're gonna soon be doing it, and hey, if you're just here to see what's up. Soonish, I like that. Okay, so we have a really nice mix, and so hopefully that's helpful for our panelists. We have a number of folks who have been doing this work or are currently engaged in this work. Quite a few people who are looking to get started, which is a really critical place, right? So you're moving from that space of hearing about and thinking about critical and multicultural research to now being the author who's publishing it. And then a few folks who are here learning, so not yet in that space. And so taking more of a reflective space, you can decide, panelists, whether you're you want to reflect back to your hey or your soon space. What advice would you have for someone who's either about to jump into this or thinking about whether they're even prepared to start engaging in and sharing multicultural and critical research?
I think that the advice I would give is that don't let it scare you. This idea is like, oh, I'm doing critical multicultural research. I have to be citing these particular people, or I have to do it in this way. Because I did my postdoc, in teacher education with people who did critical race theory, and they were like super, deep into some of these things. And I'm a quant person, so I was like, no, I'm not that deep. But yeah, here I am, right? And I think that you have to appreciate what's your contribution to this field, right? You have a perspective that's interesting and important. So whatever that is, that's what you're bringing. You don't have to be the super person in whatever area. You can bring your contribution, and that can be meaningful and really important. So I would say that that's probably the biggest thing that I would tell myself, 10, 12 years ago. It's like, yeah, you really do have an important perspective. And it's okay if it's going to pull from different little areas. You don't go super deep into here. You don't go super deep into there. It's okay if someone questions whether you're in educational psychology. Just keep going, because you have a place in this field or wherever you want to be.
Yeah, I would just dovetail with that. I think, I imagine for majority of folks on the call, the reason why you're on the call is because, you probably already have some level of critical consciousness, dissatisfaction with, the way things work in education, but then also in academia as well. So I think that, similar to what Christy was saying, like that's the perfect place to start. You may not have all the formalized language or understanding of theory, et cetera, but don't let that be too big of an intimidation point for you. I would say, the theories that you focus on in your work, or maybe the theories that you're discussing, in your classes, if you're in grad school, I'm sure that when you think about those theories, points of dissatisfaction come up for you. And I think those points of dissatisfaction are opportunities for you to really just go deeper into grappling with those theories, and then thinking about or finding or talking to other people about other theoretical frameworks that could be maybe merged with some of those ideas that you're well acquainted with but have some dissatisfaction in, or that you're discussing in your class that you might have some dissatisfaction in. So as Christy was saying, you don't need to sort of build Rome in a day, but just sort of start where you are. Start with the dissatisfaction in the ideas and the theories that you're learning about or you already know well. And then, talking to other folks, finding theoretical perspectives that sort of meet you where your dissatisfaction is, I think is just a really good place to start.
Yeah, I would just echo to the benefit of trying to get your research group to start reading more broadly and thinking about critical lenses in their work. In our research group, we often would bring an article from a critical perspective to read, like at every meeting for several subsequent meetings. And the conversations that emerged through that were just really helpful, as we all were kind of, often one of the graduate students would be more expert and kind of bring that in for us. And then we would all kind of talk and unpack it. And your research group is a pretty safe space to be kind of trying to think about new ideas that maybe you're not quite ready to talk to other people about yet. And so I found that to be really useful. And along those same lines too, if you're a graduate student interested in this, and maybe your research lab isn't thinking about questions from a multicultural lens or from a critical perspective, think about bringing that up as something that your team could think about. And you might be surprised at the level of openness and interest by the rest of your research group and kind of learning more. And I think that's a great way for us to really broaden the number of people that are doing this work in the field.
Yes, definitely. And to build off of that, 2 points. The first one is, I think maybe as a result of COVID, we learned a lot about what community means and how broad that can be. And so I definitely encourage anyone who's like in the hey or the soon area to, if your lab isn't open to or ready to start that discussion, find a larger community, like build your own lab, I would say. Obviously, you're not going to be the expert in that space, but I mean, ARA is coming up, whether you're going or not, join those groups of folks who are going, and then maybe you can create a separate chat later, and you'd be surprised how many people need that support as well because they're not getting it at their institution. So really just expand your idea of where your community is and whether it needs to be a physical space. And the second point that one of my committee members shared with me when I was defending my dissertation is to not be afraid if the data doesn't fit the theory, because the theory wasn't created for the students that I'm seeking to represent. And so feel safe in that space to really kind of question whether it's time for the theories to be updated. And so in finding researchers who are engaged in like race reimaging work who can help you navigate that space, because it can be really intimidating to say, and I disagree with Desi and Brian, or I disagree with, all of our prominent researchers, but it's not necessarily a shameful critique. It's just an acknowledgement that it's time for our field to be moving forward to thinking about the voices that weren't included when these scales were developed. And you also find a lot of the researchers are like very supportive of you doing that with their scales and things. So we have a question on the Jamboard, and then I'm going to jump into the question that was in the chat. So one of the questions on the Jamboard was, how do I effectively push back against an anonymous reviewer who was recommending the omission of diversity topics and issues in my paper? So I'll paste that in the chat, but whoever wants to jump in can.
I mean, I'll speak from my experience. It's a tricky thing with reviewers, right? Because on the one hand, you need to sort of show that you're open to taking the feedback and to making your paper better to fit with what, most reviewers are genuinely coming from a good place and they want to help you improve. But there's also that point where you have to sort of say like, no, this is what's really important to me and what I'm doing. And so there's a lot of tact that's involved. Sometimes it involves talking to a mentor, maybe someone who knows the editorial board of that journal a little bit better, to say like, what do you think is happening here? What do you read into this situation? And sometimes it's just not the journal for you, right? If the reviewers are going to be that pushy, then it's like, well, I'll publish somewhere else. But also you have to keep in mind that there are multiple reviewers, and the editors, Jamal and Lisa can talk about this. They're going to look at multiple points of feedback. I've had this one paper up until the third revision. The reviewer was like, this is not the right type of climate. Just ignore them the whole time, right? Just saying, this is my definition, this is my definition, these are my citations. And the paper was published, right? That reviewer had their say, but they were not the determining voice. So sometimes you just have to stand your ground a bit.
Yeah, I would say, that's where I think the editor can play in a really important role, but you don't always get an editor that's going to do that for you. So as you're looking at the critique from that reviewer, look specifically at what the editor might have said in relation to what you should focus on. Sometimes it's hard as an editor to call out and say like, this reviewer is wrong, don't do this. Because you have to remember that, we have to go to these reviewers numerous times, but if the editor is instead leaning into, I'd really like you to focus on this, this, and this, they're giving you a signal of like, it's okay, you can kind of ignore that. And you can also always follow up with editors. So I often have conversations with authors about their papers and how to handle a review. And I've had authors, ask like, I think this is what this reviewer is saying, and I really disagree, and here's why. and we kind of have a conversation about it, and then they can articulate that in their response back of, in conversation with the editor, I've handled this in this way, and it helps to lend some legitimacy to that response, so that you as an author don't feel like you alone are going up against this particular reviewer. And it may be that the editor didn't pick up on what you're picking up on, and that you as an author are able to kind of educate the editor a bit too, of like, this is why what they said is so problematic. And I would think that most of us who are editors are really open to having that conversation. And while it might seem intimidating to reach out to the editor of a journal, we're actually very happy to talk to authors. Our goal is, as Jamal mentioned, at least in the journal I edit, like, we really want to help authors be successful in getting their work published. And so we're willing to take that extra time to have a conversation, even if the manuscript gets rejected.
I would second all of that. I don't really have, much to add, or I don't want to be too redundant. But particularly the point around reaching out to the editor, because they're managing the task of trying to look across the reviews. And I won't say, in a lot of cases, also trying to support the author and authors as well. So that was learning how to read reviews, and what editors are saying about the reviews can sort of be difficult. It could take some time to recognize that, oh, the editor is highlighting a set of things that are really focal and not highlighting other things. That can take some time, but yeah, I definitely agree. Reaching out to the editor, as a point of leverage, is a really good idea.
Y'all are dropping all these golden nuggets. I'm trying to catch them from my own notes. And as we plan for this final session at AERA, there was another question on the Jamboard about, can and do editors push back on that pushback? And so the answer I heard you all sharing is yes. And part of your response could be to educate the editor, or it could be deciding that, if there's this much pushback against my work, maybe this in fact is not the place that I should be publishing. So that was all really helpful. A question we have in the comments is, what do you recommend we can look for when submitting work in this area? Are there any clues or items we can look for in journals that could give us a hint if our work may appeal to this journal?
I have a little bit of a complicated answer here, I guess. So I am a little bit of the persuasion. So, reading, being well read on the types of articles that come out of that journal, I think is really important. And then in addition to that, understanding how your specific paper interfaces with those parameters. It might be bullseye, it might be, more so on the boundaries, or it might be completely outside of the boundaries. Where I'm at in my career, I am pushing back a little bit more on this journal is not a good fit for my work, especially for prominent, big name ed psych type of journals. Where I'm at in my career, mid-career, I feel that it's those types of journals where the boundaries need expanding. So because I have a little bit more experience in understanding what particular journals tend to privilege, and I have, good understanding of my work and where my ideas fit in relation to that, I try to, find journals, understand their boundaries, and then choose a journal where the work is at the boundary for that journal. I'm trying to push the boundary. So when I was a little bit younger in my career, I was looking for journals that were more bullseye within that journal. It's the type of work that this type of journal traditionally publishes. And I think that's fine. in many respects, and certainly in early career. But where I'm at, I feel like these prominent journals, big name journals, need the expansion into these critical and multicultural issues. So I'm targeting those journals a little bit more, and pieces that I know that are, on the boundaries of what those journals tend to publish. So I'm not sure if that particularly answered the question, but I'm trying to push back a little bit against, well, maybe my work isn't a good fit for this journal. Like, that might be true, but I just feel we need to push against that a little bit, and expand, help, some of the editors, associate editors, reviewers at these journals to, expand what counts as good and thoughtful work, that, the journal could consider. So.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely, because the things that they tell you to do, look at the editorial board, look at what's been previously published. It's not going to work if you are trying to publish something that's critical or multicultural. And a lot of Psych journals, they might have one special issue. Actually, I think Rifty's and Jessica's paper from December pointed this out, right? It might just be one special issue a couple of years ago. So that's not what's going to that's not going to help you know whether the journal is open to it. I think what Jamal is saying about looking for that boundary and submitting at that boundary, I would say, and then suggest reviewers who are us, right? Look at the people who are in this Zoom room, and these are your reviewers, because they are going to be able, even if the editor is not someone who's like very familiar with it, then they will have a review pool to pull from and say like, oh yes, we understand where this work fits within Psych, and we can argue for how good this work is. So yeah, so that's a bit of the sort of the strategy and the bravery that has to come to help our field expand in the ways it needs to.
Great, thank you all for your questions. Well, in the responses from the panelists, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to Allison, who has a nice wrap-up question for us, and then we can jump to some information about our final session at AERA.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so we'd love for panelists, you all, to leave us with one last thought, though this is a slightly meaty question.
Yeah, so the question is, what should people carry forward with them? I feel like it's really important for people to be willing to push back, right? Like, don't just let people tell you, no, this isn't the right journal. Don't let your advisor say, no, we're not going to study that in that way. And if you are an advisor or an editor or reviewer, also be open to other perspectives and other ways of doing things. We get kind of set in our ways that we were trained and our ways of thinking about things. And so I also think it's important for those that are trying to push this of not necessarily viewing resistance as ill intent as much as not quite understanding what you're trying to say or the ways in which you're trying to do this work. There's a commitment to tradition. And so people are resistant to give up on that tradition of ways of doing things. And so I just encourage people to persist and to think about, like, how do I change the conversation? How do I change what is considered good research in this area? And even though that work is hard, I think there's a lot of people that are really highly committed to doing that work, and that there's this great community of scholars that are helping to push this field forward in really important ways and change where EdPsych is going, which I think is great.
Yeah, so for me, I would say that what you should carry with you is that tradition. So there is a tradition within EdPsych of sort of what the field is supposed to be that has excluded a lot of the topics that we're interested in. But there are also people within this field who have been doing this work for a very long time. So those are our intellectual mothers and fathers and aunties and uncles who have been doing this work and who are still around and here to help us. And so I would say, to have that sense of like, wow, there are people who've come before me who have done this. There are people who are, consider themselves really interested in these topics who don't identify with the field of educational psychology anymore, but they are still around, and they are still people that we can draw strength from. So I would say that, there are multiple traditions that we can draw from, that we can use as an inspiration to keep going and to keep trying to make this field what we think it should be. And so that's what I would say to people. And then for editors and reviewers, just to have that openness, right? And to understand that the world is a really broad place. The field is becoming a broad place, and that to have that curiosity about what it can be. And then I have one more plug for Division 15's Race and Diversity Committee. Within a few weeks, you will all be getting an invitation to participate in some small group discussions that to continue the conversation around topics like this. So please look for that. Please join with us and be a part of pushing the field forward.
Yeah, so I will just, I'm going to try and take both of those points. So Lisa's point about persisting, Christy's point about remembering some of our, I don't want to say ancestors, if you will, but, folks who have been doing this type of work in the field, for a minute, for whom this is not sort of a new or fatty type of work. And on top of that, I'll just, sort of borrow from Temi the importance of doing it in community. So as you persist, don't persist alone. This can be really difficult and challenging work, and can be sort of emotionally draining. And there are real systems and structures and patterns of tradition, in place that you're fighting against. So, don't fight that fight alone. Do it in community with other folks that you just have a good emotional or intellectual connection with. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean people that you're in physical community with, but there's a broad, given technology and what we've learned through the pandemic, community is broad. And as you do so, I think it'll just provide opportunities to connect to, the ideas and the work of people who have been doing this for a minute, who have been doing it for some time. And those people, because they've been doing the work for a while, will be excited, I would say, to be in community with you and to share, their knowledge one-on-one and, support you in whatever you need. So persist, connect with the OGs, do it in community. So that's how I'd wrap it up.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Let's show our appreciation for our panelists by throwing up your favorite reaction emoji. And while we do that, I will send it back to Temi for some closing remarks.
So let me go ahead and share my screen so we can walk through some final things as we wrap up our session. So throughout this workshop series, we've learned about research paradigms and about different methodologies. And then today we learned about dissemination of critical and multicultural research in educational psychology. And we so appreciate all of you for joining us for today's session or many of the other sessions, and encourage you to not let your learning end here. Start the folder that was shared earlier with our Google Drive information that has information from all of the sessions. Anytime folks are dropping names, resources, journals into the chat that are safe spaces for us to be publishing multicultural and critical research, we've documented that. So start that folder so that you can come back to it later. And then a great commitment for you to continue your learning is attending our session at AERA. It is at 9:50 a.m. Central Time on Thursday, April 13th. So get to AERA early, get your badge, and come on over and join us. It'll be held a lot like these workshop sessions where we'll engage with scholars about their research. We intentionally selected scholars who are new or emerging in critical and multicultural research in educational psychology. And so they'll be talking about what facilitated coordinated their work and made that possible, as well as sharing some initial findings from the projects they're currently working on. We'll then hear from Dr. Deleon Gray about ways that we as a field can create standards for engaging in critical and multicultural research. And then we'll wrap up with small group discussions, just like we had today, about how we can integrate this information into our roles at our home institution. So you'll walk away with some practical next steps that you can do. So you do not want to miss it. Even though it is one of the first sessions at AERA, we are excited to welcome you to the conference. All right, so as we close out our session, we want to thank the AERA Motivation SIG and the APA Division 15 Race and Diversity Committee for collaborating to host this series. So I'm going to steal Allison's thing, throw up your favorite reaction to show some love for those units for making this all possible and for supporting Allison and I's idea to have a workshop series like this that culminates in a session at AERA. We're so grateful for that. And then thank you to all of you for joining us today and over the course of these sessions. We hope to see you at our AERA symposium next month, and we look forward to the broader work that emerges from these conversations.